President Joe Biden took his strongest stance yet on the conflict between Israel and Palestinians in a new call with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. According to the White House, the president told the Israeli leader that he expects a, quote, significant de-escalation of violence on the path to a ceasefire. Now, Israeli warplanes fired another 120 guided missiles into Gaza overnight, and an IDF spokesman said Hamas fired 200 rockets. Now, in remarks today after that call, Netanyahu insisted Israel is doing what it can to avoid civilian casualties.
We try to target those who target us with great precision. That is not as surgical an operation as it is. Even in a surgical room in a hospital, you don't have the ability to prevent collateral damage around the affected tissues. Even then you can't. And certainly in a military operation you cannot.
We also heard today from Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who spoke from the West Bank. He called the Israel bombardment war crimes punishable by an international court. Now, there is a growing humanitarian crisis within Gaza's closed borders. At least 219 Palestinians have died, according to Gaza health officials, including 63 children. Now, hundreds of buildings have been destroyed, according to UN workers on the ground. That includes hospitals, schools, and homes, leaving an estimated 50,000 people homeless. Now, UN workers also report broken pipes, sewage in the streets, and electricity that only comes on for hours, if at all. Joining us now from Tel Aviv is NBC News correspondent Erin McLaughlin. So, Erin, Israel insists it's doing what it can to avoid what Netanyahu calls creating collateral damage. But walk us through this situation unfolding in Gaza right now.
Well, Jeff, it's certainly a desperate situation, especially when you consider that Gaza is densely populated. Some 2 million people live in a 25-mile-long stretch of land. And that land has been blockaded by both Israel and Egypt for some time now. So it's taken what was a bad situation, this latest violence, and making it even worse. Night after night of bombardment by Israeli fighter jets. Just last night alone, in a span of some 25 minutes, 52 Israeli fighter jets, according to the Israeli military, bombarding some 40 targets. Civilians I've spoken to on the ground there in Gaza were absolutely terrified, saying that the conditions are going from bad to worse. There's electricity issues, water issues, sanitation issues, tens of thousands of people displaced, crowding into schools. COVID is a concern. Take a listen to what one doctor had to say.
The people are fleeing from their homes. They go to shelters. More than 50,000 people have already left their homes, going back to shelters. Of course, there is overcrowding in those schools, the shelters, and we are asking everybody previously for social distancing. There will be no way for social distancing in schools, and corona for sure will spread quickly in those days. I assure you that the health system will collapse in the coming few days because there will be no room to treat any more victims of this aggression.
Now, while civilians are traumatized there in Gaza, they're also traumatized here in Israel. Today alone, according to Israeli military sources, some 250 rockets fired at Israel, the majority of those intercepted by the Iron Dome system. Nevertheless, Israelis running for cover, Israelis also scared, wanting this conflict to end. Jeff?
NBC's Erin McLaughlin with the latest on-the-ground reporting. Erin, our thanks to you. Joining me now is former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Egypt, Daniel Kurtzer. He's a professor of Middle Eastern policy studies at Princeton University. Thanks for joining us. And I'll start with this. You've got international pressure building. The French, Egyptian, Jordanian governments today, they pledged to work through the United Nations Security Council to achieve a ceasefire. The Biden administration has been participating in what they call quiet diplomacy. Has the international response, has the U.S. response met the moment, do you think?
I think not. Look, for the president, this has been a diversion from a very ambitious domestic agenda and a foreign policy agenda that didn't include Israeli-Palestinian issues. So the conflict took the administration a bit by surprise. They also are not staffed up. We don't have an ambassador on the ground. We don't have an assistant secretary. And so they've kind of been making it up as they went along, to a point where the president has now made several phone calls to Netanyahu, ratcheting up the verbal pressure. But at the same time, the United States has blocked some actions in the UN Security Council, which suggests that it's not going to be a full-fledged pressure on Israel. We want to make sure that the idea of Israeli self-defense is preserved, and therefore international efforts may fall flat.
Netanyahu declared today that airstrikes in the Gaza Strip would continue. That was, of course, after President Biden demanded he immediately wind down a conflict that has killed more than 200 people. So given all of that, what is the incentive for an American president to step into this conflict?
Well, the international response may be a bit flaccid, but the reality is that international pressure on the United States will grow to do something. The humanitarian situation, which your correspondent reported, is horrible. Not just the number of people dead and wounded, but the long-term effect of no electricity, no sewage system, no water provision in an already overcrowded, problematic area. And as the doctor in Gaza reported, the health system is on the verge of collapse. And so it's one thing to give Israel a little more time to finish the operation. It's quite another to look ahead and see this humanitarian disaster looming, which is far worse than almost anywhere else in the world, except perhaps in Yemen.
So I'll ask you, as we wrap up, the question I've been asking to other experts, which I think it might be instructive. I mean, at this point, what does de-escalation look like to you?
Well, I think there are two steps. The first is the president getting very, very serious with Prime Minister Netanyahu and saying, that's it. You've achieved what you've achieved. Maybe it's not 100% of what you wanted, but this must stop. At the same time, as Egypt and others are telling the same thing to Hamas. Once that happens, however, there must be a second step, and that is to go back to the problems that originally created this in Jerusalem and make sure that we don't have another outbreak as a result of Israeli pressures, largely stimulated by extremists, to dispossess Palestinian homeowners in the eastern part of that city.
Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, my thanks to you for joining us this afternoon.